Everything I thought I knew about my life turned out to be a lie. I don't say this as some dramatic phrase. I mean it literally. In one moment, 20 years of marriage shattered like a glass vase on the floor, and I was left standing among the pieces, too afraid to move, afraid the sound of my own breath might make the shards cut deeper. I always imagined betrayal as something obvious, the kiss of another woman, the smell of strange perfume clinging to his shirt, the rumpled bed that told a story without words. But what I discovered was worse than any affair, worse than any late-night confession whispered with shame, because an affair is temporary. What he had been hiding was permanent. It was not a moment of weakness. It was his real life, the one he carefully protected while offering me a hollow version of himself. And I was nothing but the shadow wife, a stand-in, a quiet figure filling the spaces he couldn't afford to leave empty. When I close my eyes now, I feel like I didn't live 20 years, but someone else's dream, scripted and rehearsed without my consent. I watched his face at breakfast. I ironed his shirts. I waited for him to come home late at night. And all of it was a performance, a set of props and costumes meant to distract me from the truth. The silence between us was never just the silence of a tired marriage. It was a wall, a boundary I was never meant to cross, the barrier behind which he kept his real family. And I will tell it all, step by step, because even now the words taste unreal on my tongue. For 2 decades, I lived beside a man I never truly knew. From the outside, our life looked perfectly ordinary, almost enviable in its quiet stability. A modest house in a safe suburb outside of Cleveland. The kind of place where neighbors wave from their driveways but never ask too many questions. The lawn was always cut, the mailbox painted fresh white, and every December I strung lights along the roof just the way he liked it. Symmetrical, orderly, not a bulb out of place. We raised our daughter there, watched her ride her bike down the cul-de-sac, listened to the summer's sprinklers, take in the evenings while fireflies glowed above the grass. If anyone asked me then, I would have said we were a normal family, maybe even a happy one. But happiness has a way of turning into routine, and routine has a way of numbing the senses. I told myself that distance in a marriage was natural, that after 2 decades together, people stop holding hands at the movies, stop writing notes on napkins, stop looking at each other as if the world could end tomorrow. I believed that his long hours at work were a sacrifice for us, for our future, for our daughter's college tuition. And when the silence between us grew heavier, I filled it with excuses. Tiredness, age, the slow erosion of passion that everyone warns you about. But beneath the surface, something in me always knew the silence had another meaning. I would hear his phone buzz and feel a flicker of dread. I would catch the faintest whiff of a perfume that wasn't mine and swallow the thought before it could form into words. I told myself I was imagining things, that suspicion was uglier than trust. I folded his shirts, cooked his dinners, paid the bills, and convinced myself that loyalty meant silence. That if I just kept everything in order, the cracks in our life would never show. The first real fracture appeared on a Thursday evening, though at the time I told myself it was nothing. He came home late, later than usual, and when he walked through the door, there was a faint trace of something on him. An unfamiliar perfume, not strong, but sharp enough to cut through the usual scent of his aftershave. I stood there in the kitchen with the pasta boiling over, trying to decide if I should ask, but the words lodged in my throat. He kissed me on the cheek in that absent-minded way he had developed over the years, barely touching, already turning toward the stairs before I could respond. I noticed his phone, too, how he kept it in his pocket now, even when he went to shower, how he turned it face down on the table when it buzzed. Once, when he wasn't looking, I saw a name I didn't recognize flash across the screen. Just 3 letters and a heart emoji. My stomach knotted, but I laughed it off in front of him, pretended not to notice. Suspicion, I told myself, was poison. If I opened that door, If I started digging, I would never stop. But the signs kept multiplying. The sudden business trips that had no receipts, the way his eyes darted away when I asked about his day, the settled tension in his shoulders when I walked into the room. At night, lying beside him, I would feel the distance like a canyon, his back turned toward me, his breathing steady but unreachable. And in those moments, I would wonder if marriage wasn't about love at all, but about endurance, about who could stay silent the longest while pretending not to see the truth written in plain sight. One night, when the unease grew heavier than my fear, I did the thing I swore I would never do. I waited until he fell asleep, the quiet rhythm of his breathing steady beside me, and I reached for his phone on the nightstand. My hand trembled as if I were committing a crime, though the only crime was the silence that had been eating away at us for years. I told myself I would look at just one message, just enough to put my mind at rest. But the screen was locked, protected by a passcode I didn't know. That realization cut deeper than any message could have. After 20 years together, after raising a child and sharing a bed and a mortgage, I was locked out of his world by 4 digits. I put the phone back, but the weight of that discovery pressed on my chest like a stone. From that night on, every sound of his phone buzzing felt like a secret he was holding against me. I tried to convince myself that all marriages had their mysteries, that privacy was not betrayal. Yet the doubt festered, growing louder in the silence of our bedroom, in the clink of dishes I washed alone, in the mornings when he left before sunrise without a word. It wasn't just the perfume anymore, or the long hours, or the way he turned his face away from me. It was the certainty deep in my bones that the man sleeping next to me was already living another life, and I was nothing more than the shadow left behind. It was a Saturday morning when I finally crossed the line between suspicion and action. He said he had a meeting downtown, something about a client who insisted on weekend hours. He dressed carefully, more carefully than usual, in a pressed shirt I had never seen before, a tie that still smelled faintly of the store. I watched him leave, watched the taillights of his car disappear down our quiet street, and instead of turning back to the laundry or the grocery list, I grabbed my keys. My heart pounded as if I were about to commit a sin. I followed him, keeping far enough back to convince myself he wouldn't notice, though the truth was, he never looked in the mirror. He drove past the office district, past the restaurants, turning instead into a neighborhood I didn't recognize, a stretch of houses lined with maple trees and basketball hoops over garage doors. He parked in front of a modest white house with a porch swing, the kind of place where children's laughter seemed to hang in the air, even when the street was quiet. I watched as he stepped out, straightened his tie, and walked up the driveway. The door opened before he could knock, and a woman appeared, smiling in a way I hadn't smiled in years. She leaned into him, her hand brushing his arm with an ease that told me this was not the first time. And then a child, a little boy, no older than 8, ran out and wrapped himself around his legs, shouting a word that split me open. "Daddy." I sat frozen in my car, the engine still running, realizing in that instant that everything I thought was hidden behind his phone, his late nights, his excuses, was not a fling or a mistake. It was a life that had no room for me except as the other woman in a marriage I had believed was mine. I drove home in a haze, every streetlight stretching into a blur, every familiar turn of the road feeling like I was drifting through a dream I couldn't wake from. My hands gripped the steering wheel so tightly that my knuckles turned white, but I felt nothing. No pain, no tears, just a hollow silence inside me. When I pulled into our driveway, the house looked different, as though I were seeing it for the first time. The porch, the flower beds I had planted, the curtains I had chosen with care, they all belonged to a version of me that no longer existed. I walked inside, dropped my keys on the counter, and sat at the kitchen table, staring at the wood grain until the lines blurred into rivers. For years, I had filled this house with routines. Sunday pancakes, birthday balloons taped to the walls, the smell of laundry detergent clinging to every corner. But now, each memory felt counterfeit, like photographs staged for an album no one would ever look at again. He had smiled at me across this very table. He had kissed our daughter goodnight in the hallway. And yet all of it was borrowed affection, pieces of a performance that had nothing to do with truth. I thought about the boy's voice, "Daddy," echoing in my ears, louder than the hum of the refrigerator, louder than my own pulse. It was not the voice of a stranger's child. It was the voice of a son who had lived a life parallel to mine, hidden only by miles of suburb and the weight of my own denial. For 20 years, I had believed I was a wife. That word, that identity, had shaped every breath I took. And now, with one glimpse of a front porch and a child's embrace, I realized I had never truly been one at all. I sat in that silence for hours, the day sliding past me unnoticed, the shadows in the kitchen growing long and then dissolving into night. My daughter called once, just to say she had arrived safely back at campus, her voice bright and full of the freedom I once believed would be mine too. I almost told her, the words pressed against my lips like a secret demanding to be spoken. "Your father has another family. We've been living in a lie." But I swallowed it. What right did I have to stain her world with the truth before I even understood it myself? Instead, I told her I was proud, told her to take care, and listened as she laughed about some trivial story with her friends. When the call ended, the silence was even heavier, and I realized I was holding my breath. Should I confront him tonight? Demand an explanation the moment he walked through that door? Or should I wait? Gather proof? Make him face not only me, but the weight of his deception? The thought of his keys jangling in the lock made my stomach twist, but another thought, darker, more paralyzing, took root. What if he had no shame to offer? What if he had lived this way so long that lies were simply his truth? I imagined his calm face, his practiced smile, the way he would brush off my questions as if I were imagining shadows in the room. And in that moment, I realized the cruelest part of betrayal isn't the act itself. It's the silence you're forced to carry when the truth feels too heavy to speak aloud. That evening, he walked through the door as if nothing in the world had shifted. He set down his briefcase, loosened his tie, and kissed me on the cheek with the same distant politeness he had perfected over the years. The smell of someone else's perfume had faded, replaced by the sterile scent of his aftershave, but I felt it still clinging to him like an invisible shadow. I'd cooked dinner out of habit, though I hadn't tasted a single bite while stirring the pot, and now the plates sat waiting on the table like props on a stage. He asked about my day in that vague, obligatory way, his eyes sliding over me as though checking off a box on a list. I answered with lies of my own, small, hollow sentences that filled the air but carried no truth. The clink of silverware against porcelain sounded unbearably loud. Each bite he took a reminder of the secret lodged between us. I watched his hands, steady and calm. The same hands that had touched another woman, held a child who called him father. I wondered if he rehearsed this life the way an actor rehearses lines, slipping from one role to another without breaking character. My chest tightened as I imagined asking him outright, imagined the words tearing through the fragile fabric of our performance. Who is she? Who is the boy? But the fear of his answer silenced me. Instead, I smiled faintly, nodded at the right moments, and carried the plates to the sink when it was over. He turned on the television, a sports channel humming in the background, while I stood at the counter with my hands under cold water, gripping the edge so hard that my knuckles burned. To him, it was just another evening. To me, it was the first night I truly understood that I was living inside a stranger's life. That night, I lay beside him in the dark, listening to the steady rhythm of his breathing, while my own chest felt locked in a storm. I thought of the woman at the door, the boy with his small arms clinging to him, the word that had cut through me like glass. Daddy. The silence between us was unbearable, yet I couldn't break it. My mouth formed the questions over and over. Who are they? How long? Why me? But every time I imagined the sound of my own voice in that stillness, I felt the world collapsing. What if he denied it and left me doubting my own eyes? What if he admitted it and proved that 20 years had been nothing but a carefully managed lie? I turned toward him, searching his profile in the glow of the streetlight seeping through the curtains. He looked peaceful, almost innocent, his face softened by sleep. It struck me how much easier it must be for him to rest, knowing he controlled both worlds while I was trapped in one. The weight of the truth pressed on me like a secret too heavy to carry alone. But the thought of sharing it with anyone, even my closest friend, made me feel exposed, raw, ashamed. I had always believed that betrayal would make me furious, that I would scream, slam doors, burn bridges. Instead, I felt hollow, like a vessel emptied out, the echo of his other life rattling inside me. I wondered how long I could keep pretending, how many more nights I could lie still in the dark, his hand inches from mine, while the truth devoured me from the inside. The next morning, unable to carry the weight alone any longer, I called my oldest friend. We had known each other since college, shared dorm rooms and secrets, and she had been the maid of honor at my wedding. If anyone could hold this truth without judgment, it would be her. My voice shook as I told her I needed to talk, that it was serious. And within an hour, we were sitting in the back booth of a quiet diner off the highway, coffee cups steaming between us. I tried to find the words, but they came out broken, jagged, as if my mouth didn't know how to shape them. I told her about following him, about the house, about the woman and the boy. I expected her eyes to widen, for her hand to reach across the table, for outrage or shock. Instead, she sighed, stirred her coffee slowly, and said, "Honey, men do this. It's not the end of the world. You'll either forgive him or you'll leave him, but don't act like you're the first." Her voice was calm, almost bored, as though I were complaining about a bad haircut. My stomach turned. Didn't she understand? This wasn't an affair tucked between business trips, wasn't a fling in a hotel room. This was a family, a child, a parallel life I had been blind to for 2 decades. I wanted to scream at her, to shake her until she felt the earthquake tearing through me. But I just sat there, staring into my untouched coffee. Her words left me colder than silence. For the first time, I realized the isolation of betrayal wasn't only in what he had done, it was in the emptiness of the responses I would receive when I dared to share it. Driving back from the diner, I felt more alone than when I had left the house. The world outside my window looked unchanged. Traffic lights, strip malls, mothers pushing strollers along the sidewalks. But inside me, everything had shifted. Betrayal is not just a wound, it's an exile. I had stepped outside the borders of my old life and realized no one was coming to meet me there. When I pulled into the driveway, his car was already parked, gleaming under the afternoon sun. My pulse quickened, each beat like a hammer striking the inside of my chest. I sat in the car for a long time, gripping the steering wheel, rehearsing words I wasn't sure I had the courage to say. Where were you? Who is she? Whose child calls you father? The questions tumbled in my mind like stones, heavy and sharp, but I knew once I threw them into the open, there would be no gathering them back. Inside, the house smelled faintly of his cologne, as if he had just walked through. I found him in the living room, tie loosened, shoes off, flipping casually through the channels. The sight of him, so ordinary, so relaxed, filled me with a rage that trembled just beneath my skin. I stood there in the doorway, my mouth dry, watching the man I had built my life around as though he were a stranger who had broken into my home. He looked up at me, smiled faintly, and asked what I wanted for dinner. That simple question, spoken with the ease of routine, was almost unbearable. I opened my mouth, and for the first time, the words pressed so hard against my throat I thought they would finally break free. The words came out sharper than I expected, cutting through the hum of the television like glass shattering on tile. "Where were you last Saturday?" My voice trembled, but it was louder than I had ever dared in years. He blinked, slowly, as if the question hadn't registered, then muted the screen and leaned back on the couch. "Work?" he said simply, his tone flat, almost rehearsed. I felt my nails dig into the doorframe. "Don't lie to me," I whispered, though my body was shaking so violently I thought I might collapse. His expression didn't change. He sighed, rubbed his temple, and repeated, "Work, meetings, the usual. Why are you suddenly asking me this?" The casualness of his denial was worse than any confession. It was the ease of a man who had been preparing for this moment for years, who had built a fortress of routine around his lies. I wanted to scream, to tell him I had followed him, that I had seen the woman, the boy, the word daddy hanging in the air like a knife. But the thought of saying it aloud, of watching his face shift from calm to something else, anger, mockery, indifference, froze me. I stood there, my breath ragged, while he returned his gaze to the television, as if my question had been nothing more than static in the room. In that silence, I realized the truth I had been avoiding. He would never hand me an admission. He had buried himself too deep inside his other life to ever drag it into the light. If I wanted answers, I would have to tear them out piece by piece.
That night, I couldn't sleep. His breathing beside me was steady, almost peaceful, while my mind spun like a wheel stuck in mud, churning the same thoughts over and over. If he would not give me the truth, I would have to find it myself. In the morning, after he left for work, I began searching, not wildly, not recklessly, but with the cold focus of someone who has already lost too much to care about shame. I opened drawers I had dusted for years without ever peeking inside, flipped through folders stacked neatly in the study, and scanned envelopes with unfamiliar names. At first there was nothing, just bills and receipts that proved the life I already knew. But then, tucked between tax forms, I found an envelope with an address I didn't recognize, written in his hand. My chest tightened as I copied it down. A checking account statement revealed transfers to a name I had never heard before. Regular, consistent, amounts too large to be accidents. My hands shook as I held the papers, not because I didn't expect them, but because the confirmation was worse than suspicion. The house I had seen, the woman, the boy, none of it had been imagination. They were being sustained month after month with the same money that paid for our groceries, our mortgage, our daughter's books. I sat at his desk with the evidence spread before me, the morning light spilling across the papers like a cruel spotlight. Betrayal wasn't hidden in shadows anymore. It was ink on bank statements, numbers typed in neat rows, undeniable and final. He had built a life parallel to mine, funded by the same hands that once held mine at an altar where he promised forever. I stared at the papers until the numbers blurred, until the names and addresses dissolved into a haze of ink and white. It wasn't an affair. It wasn't a careless mistake, some fleeting hunger that could be explained away by midlife boredom or loneliness. What I was holding in my hands was evidence of permanence, of structure. These weren't the marks of a secret fling. They were the quiet architecture of another household. Rent, utilities, groceries, school fees. A rhythm of transactions that spoke of dinners cooked, lights kept on, birthdays celebrated. My chest ached as I realized that while I was planning our daughter's graduation, he was just as carefully planning someone else's Christmas. While I hung stockings on our fireplace, he must have been tucking another child into bed, whispering the same words I once believed were mine alone. Good night. I love you. My mind reeled back through the years, every late meeting, every business trip, every moment I excused with a tired smile. I had been filling the silence with explanations that made sense only because I wanted them to. The truth had been standing behind me all along, patient and merciless. I thought betrayal would be sharp, quick, a blade to the heart. But this was slow erosion, a decades-long theft of everything I thought was real. And the cruelest part was not that he had given himself to someone else. It was that he had divided his life so neatly, so efficiently, that I never even suspected I was only half of a story. I gathered the papers into a neat stack, though my hands trembled so badly the edges tore. For years, I'd told myself that silence was strength, that pretending not to see was the glue holding our family together. But staring at those statements, I realized silence had only made me complicit. I wasn't just his wife. I was the unwitting accomplice in my own erasure. Every smile I forced, every excuse I whispered to myself at night had been part of the disguise. I thought about confronting him then, the moment he came through the door, shoving the papers into his chest and screaming until my throat burned. But something in me resisted, because I didn't want him to twist it into another story, to call me paranoid, dramatic, unstable. I wanted the truth to stand naked, undeniable, even to his face. That night, as I lay awake listening to the steady hum of the ceiling fan, I decided I would no longer wait for the right moment to arrive. I would make it. I would look into his eyes and ask, not as a wife pleading for scraps of honesty, but as a woman who had finally seen through the walls he had built. And for the first time in weeks, maybe years, the fear of losing him was smaller than the fear of losing myself.
He came home just after 9, loosening his tie as he stepped through the door, the picture of routine. I waited for him in the kitchen, the stack of papers on the table between us like a silent witness. For a moment, he didn't notice, moving to the fridge, asking if there were leftovers. My voice stopped him mid-step. Who are they? The question landed heavy in the air, sharper than I had rehearsed, trembling but unrelenting. His hand froze on the refrigerator handle. Slowly, he turned, his eyes narrowing just slightly as they flicked to the papers. "What are you talking about?" he asked, calm, too calm, like a teacher correcting a child's mistake. My chest burned as I pushed the documents toward him. Bank transfers, addresses, names. "Don't pretend," I whispered. "I saw the house. I saw her. I saw the boy." For a moment, something flickered in his eyes. Fear, maybe, or recognition? But it vanished behind the mask he had worn for so long. "You're imagining things," he said evenly, sliding the papers back as if they were meaningless. "You're tired. You've been under stress." The dismissal stung worse than an admission. He was rewriting my reality in front of me, counting on my silence, on the years I had spent swallowing doubts. I wanted to scream, to claw through the mask until he broke, but all I managed was a whisper. "I am not crazy." My voice cracked, but it was steady enough to echo in the kitchen. And for the first time, I saw it. The flicker of uncertainty in his eyes, the realization that I would not go back to silence. He didn't shout, didn't confess, didn't even argue. He simply pushed back from the table, gathered his keys, and walked toward the door. "I don't have to listen to this," he said, quietly, as though my questions were noise, nothing more. The door closed behind him with a softness that felt crueler than any slam. I stood in the kitchen, the lamplight buzzing faintly overhead, the papers still spread across the table like a crime scene no one would acknowledge. The silence was unbearable, pressing against my ears until I thought they would burst. I sat down, tracing the numbers on the statements with my fingertip, as if the ink itself might tell me what he wouldn't. My reflection in the window looked boring, pale, and hollow, like a woman watching herself from the outside. In that moment, I realized the worst part of betrayal isn't the act itself, it's the absence it leaves behind. No fight, no apology, no truth to grasp. Only the empty chair across the table and the echo of a door closing. I pressed my palms flat against the papers, grounding myself in their reality, because if I let go even for a second, I might start believing his version instead of mine. My hands trembled, but I whispered it aloud just to hear it in the room. I saw them. I know what I saw. The sound of my own voice was the only anchor I had left.
That night, sleep never came. Instead, memories unspooled in the darkness like old film reels, scenes I had once cherished, now playing back with a sickening tint. I remembered our wedding day, the way his hands had trembled slightly as he slid the ring onto my finger. At the time, I thought it was nerves, the kind that comes with love too big for words. Now I wondered if it was guilt, the weight of a promise he never intended to keep. I remembered our first apartment, tiny and drafty, where we ate takeout on the floor because we couldn't afford furniture yet. I had thought of it as a beginning, a foundation we would build on together. But what if even then I had been only half of his life? Every anniversary dinner, every vacation photo, every moment I once thought of as ours now felt like a carefully edited version of the truth, as if I had been living inside a scrapbook where whole pages were missing. I tried to summon the warmth I used to feel when his arm brushed mine, when his voice softened at night, but all I found was emptiness. It was like touching a scar. You can trace the shape, but the pain belongs to a wound that will never fully heal. I wondered how many lies had been woven into the fabric of our home, how many nights I had kissed him goodnight while another woman waited for him somewhere else. And the most unbearable thought of all was that he might have loved them more, that my life had been the imitation, not the original.
When dawn finally broke, I sat at the edge of my daughter's empty bed, staring at the quilt we had picked out together before she left for college. The room still smelled faintly of her perfume, a sweetness that made my chest ache. She had always looked at her father with such admiration, as if he were the steady anchor of her world. What would this truth do to her? How could I tell her that the man she trusted most had lived 2 lives, that she herself was only part of a half-kept promise? My mind twisted through the possibilities: anger, grief, betrayal. But the image that kept haunting me was her face falling into silence the way mine had. I wanted to protect her, to shield her from the ugliness that had already poisoned me. But I also knew silence was another kind of betrayal. She deserved to know who her father really was, even if it destroyed her idea of family. I pressed my forehead against the wall, whispering her name like a prayer, torn between 2 unbearable choices: to let her keep living in the safety of illusion, or to pull the ground out from under her feet with the truth. And beneath it all was the quieter, crueler question I couldn't push away. Had he ever looked at her and seen what I saw? Or was she too just another child divided between 2 separate worlds? When he came home that evening, I was waiting in the living room, the papers still on the table, untouched since the night before. He looked at me with the same practiced indifference, as if expecting the storm to have passed, as if silence would once again swallow the questions he refused to answer. But this time I didn't whisper. My voice was steady, sharp. Does she know about our daughter? His eyes flickered just for a second, the calm mask cracking at the edges. "What are you talking about?" He said, the words slow, deliberate. "Stop this nonsense." I leaned forward, my hands gripping the armrest of the chair, my heart hammering so loudly I could hear it in my ears. She has the right to know. If you can live with 2 lives, at least have the decency to tell her she is only half of yours. For the first time, he didn't look away. His jaw tightened, his lips pressed into a line, and I saw something cold settle in his expression. Not regret, not shame, but calculation. He was measuring how much I knew, how far I was willing to go.
The silence stretched between us until it felt like the walls themselves were listening. Finally, he muttered, "Don't drag her into this. She doesn't need to know." The way he said it, protective, almost possessive, made my stomach twist. He wasn't protecting her, he was protecting himself. And in that moment, I realized the truth was bigger than my marriage, bigger than my pain. It wasn't just my life he had stolen, it was hers too.
After he went upstairs, leaving me in the half-lit living room with the hum of the refrigerator and the flicker of the muted television, I felt the weight of choice pressing against my chest. For years, I had told myself that silence was survival, that keeping the peace was its own kind of love. But silence had hollowed me out until there was nothing left but echoes of his lies. Now the cost of it was no longer mine alone. It was hers too. My daughter, who had built her faith on the image of a father who never really belonged to us. I sat on the couch, staring at the staircase where he had just disappeared, and felt a strange calm wash over me. Not peace, but clarity. The life I thought I was protecting had already collapsed. I had been living in its ruins for years. The only decision left was whether I would continue sweeping the rubble under the rug or finally turn on the light and see it for what it was. My hands trembled as I imagined telling her, imagined the look on her face, the breaking of something fragile and irreplaceable. But wasn't the breaking already here? I pressed my palms together, whispering to the empty room, "She deserves the truth, even if it burns, even if it leaves nothing standing." That night, I couldn't bear the weight of the bedroom, the steady rhythm of his breathing beside me like a metronome counting out years of deception. I crept downstairs to the kitchen, flicked on the small lamp above the sink, and sat at the table with a glass of water that tasted metallic in my mouth. The silence of the house was immense, the kind that presses on your skin, demanding to be filled. I laid the papers out again, spread them like cards in a game I had already lost, and whispered the truth into the empty room. He has another family. He has a son. I was never the wife. I was the other. The words felt foreign at first, like I was reciting someone else's story. But as they left my lips, they rooted themselves inside me with a cold certainty. For years, I had been terrified of naming it, of shattering the fragile shell of normalcy. But the moment I spoke it aloud, I realized the shell had never protected me. It had only kept me blind. Tears came then, sudden and relentless, falling onto the papers until the ink bled and blurred. I pressed my forehead to the table, choking on sobs that seemed to rise from a place deeper than grief, from a hollow carved out over decades. And in that collapse, I found something unexpected, a thin thread of defiance. Because if I could say it here, in this kitchen at midnight, then one day I could say it to her. One day, I could give her the truth that was stolen from both of us. Morning light spilled through the curtains, pale and unforgiving, as if the world itself had no patience for secrets anymore. I sat at the table with cold coffee, my eyes swollen from the night before, when I heard his footsteps coming down the stairs. He entered the kitchen with the same casual ease, tying his tie, scrolling through his phone, humming faintly under his breath. Once that sound had meant safety, the familiar rhythm of routine. Now it felt obscene, a performance played just for me, as though he believed I would never see past the mask. He kissed the top of my head as he passed, the gesture automatic, and I froze beneath it. I realized, with a clarity that sliced through me, that I no longer flinched from his absence, I flinched from his presence. Every detail of him felt like evidence. The neat fold of his shirt collar, the clean scent of his aftershave, the easy way he slipped his keys into his pocket. Each one screamed of the other life he carried with the same practiced grace. He looked at me then, just briefly, and asked if I needed anything from the store. His eyes were calm, too calm, like a man who still believed in his ability to edit reality. And for the first time, I didn't answer. I just stared at him, my silence deliberate, heavy, making him pause for half a second before looking away. Something had shifted irreversibly. I was no longer the wife clinging to illusions. I was the witness, and he was the stranger who had lived in my house for 20 years. That afternoon, my daughter called, her voice spilling through the phone like sunlight I could no longer feel. She told me about classes, about new friends, about a professor who reminded her of her grandfather, and I listened with a smile that felt brittle, my throat tightening with every word. I wanted to tell her, to shatter the illusion before it calcified into her adulthood, to hand her the truth, even if it burned her hands. The words trembled on my tongue. Your father has another family. He isn't who you think he is. But as she laughed about some inside joke with her roommate, I couldn't do it. I couldn't take the lightness from her voice. Not yet. Instead, I asked if she was eating enough, if she was getting sleep, the small motherly questions that filled the silence where the real confession should have been. When she said, "I miss you both," something in me cracked. I pressed my hand against my mouth to keep from sobbing, answering only, "We miss you too." The lie slid out of me with the ease of habit, but it cut deeper than any truth could have. When the call ended, I sat with the phone in my lap, staring at the dark screen, feeling the ache of two betrayals, his and now mine. I was protecting her the way I had protected myself, with silence, with denial, with the hope that pretending a little longer might keep the world intact. But I knew, even as the thought comforted me for a moment, that the silence would not hold forever. That night, I opened a bottle of wine, not out of celebration, but desperation, pouring glass after glass until the room blurred at the edges. I sat on the kitchen floor with my back against the cabinets, the hum of the refrigerator filling the silence like a cruel lullaby. Around me, the house felt foreign, a museum of a life I no longer recognized. The framed photographs on the wall, the souvenirs from vacations, the trinkets gathered over decades. Each object whispered a lie, a reminder of the story I had been sold and believed with all my heart. I thought of the vows we exchanged, of the nights I cradled our daughter while he promised that everything would be fine, of the mornings I packed his lunch and kissed him at the door. All of it seemed obscene now, props in a performance I hadn't realized I was part of. I whispered the words into the dark, slurring them through tears and wine. My life was never mine. It was borrowed. It was stolen. The admission tore through me, raw and jagged, and I let myself sob until my throat burned. I had always imagined that betrayal would end with rage, with shattered dishes and screaming matches. Instead, it ended here, with me alone on a cold kitchen floor, whispering confessions to no one. And in the hollow of that breakdown, in the wreckage of everything I thought I was, I understood the truth I had avoided for too long. I could never go back. The life I had been living was gone, and the woman who lived it had died quietly without me noticing. When the morning came, the wine was still on the counter, the glass tipped on its side, a dark stain bleeding across the table. My head ached, my body heavy, but beneath the fog there was a strange clarity, a silence inside me that no longer felt like defeat, but like decision. I cleaned the stain, set the glass upright, and for the first time in years, I didn't move on autopilot. I didn't fold his shirts or brew his coffee. I didn't wait for his footsteps on the stairs. Instead, I opened a drawer in the kitchen and pulled out a fresh notebook, the kind I always bought and never used. On the first page, with a hand that trembled but did not stop, I wrote 3 sentences. He has another family. He has a son. I was never his wife. I was his secret. Seeing the words in ink felt like a crack of light splitting through a wall. It was no longer just in my head, no longer something he could erase with calm denials or quiet gaslighting. It was written. It existed. And as I stared at the page, I realized that the life I'd clung to so desperately wasn't mine to protect. It had never been real to begin with. The only thing left to protect was myself and the daughter who deserved more than shadows and silence. That evening, when he returned, I didn't greet him at the door, didn't ask about his day, didn't slip back into the rhythm he expected. I waited until he set down his briefcase, until the house was heavy with the ordinary silence we both knew too well, and then I spoke. My voice was calm, even, stripped of the tremor that had haunted me before. "I know everything," I said. No accusations, no details, just the truth laid bare between us. He froze, his hands still on the back of the chair he had been about to pull out, and for the first time in years, he didn't reach for words. His silence told me more than any denial could. I met his eyes and continued, steady, deliberate. "You have 2 lives, and I will not spend another day living inside the shadow of one of them." The words were not a threat, not a plea. They were a boundary. He opened his mouth, then closed it again, his expression a flicker of anger, calculation, and something close to fear. I didn't wait for his explanation. I didn't need it. I had seen the house, the woman, the boy. I had touched the proof with my own hands. For 20 years, he had controlled the story. But that night, for the first time, I spoke without his permission. And in the quiet that followed, I felt the faintest shift inside me. Not freedom yet, not healing, but the beginning of a door cracking open. After he left the room, the air felt strangely lighter, though my chest still ached as if I'd been holding my breath for years. I sat alone at the table, the silence no longer suffocating, but raw, a wound exposed to air. The truth had been spoken, and it couldn't be taken back. Not by his denials, not by my fear. For the first time in 2 decades, the path ahead was mine, though it stretched out into a darkness I could not yet see through. I was terrified of the bills, of the empty house, of explaining to my daughter why her family was never what she believed. Yet beneath that terror was something else. Something I hadn't felt since I was a girl scribbling dreams into journals no one else read. Possibility. I realized that I had lived my whole life as a supporting character in a story he wrote. And now, even if my voice shook, I was writing my own line. It wasn't freedom, not yet. It wasn't peace. But it was a beginning, and beginnings are always small, fragile things. I touched the page of the notebook where I had written the truth and pressed my hand over the ink as though to seal it. Whatever came next, pain, rebuilding, loneliness, it would be mine. And for the first time in 20 years, mine was enough. When my daughter called again that weekend, I almost slipped back into the habit of pretending, of asking about her classes, her friends, the trivial things that once masked the silence in my own life. But something in me shifted. The weight of secrecy pressed harder now that I had spoken aloud to him. I couldn't let her carry a false picture of a family that had never existed. So I told her, gently, carefully, that her father and I were not what we seemed, that he had made choices that broke the foundation of our lives. I didn't give her the full story, not yet, the other house, the boy who shared his blood, but I let her see the crack in the frame she had trusted. Her voice went quiet, too quiet, and I could almost hear her mind racing on the other end of the line. She asked if everything would be okay, and though every instinct in me wanted to lie, I whispered the truth. I don't know, but we will face it. It was the first time I had promised her something real, not the illusions I had repeated for years. When the call ended, I sat in the stillness and realized I was no longer alone in the silence. For better or worse, I had invited her into the truth. And though it hurt, it was the only gift I had left to give her. Reality instead of performance. The nights are still long, and sometimes I wake with the same hollow ache, The question of how I missed the signs for so many years pressing against my chest. But the difference now is that I no longer try to erase the ache with lies. I let it sit with me, like an old companion who has finally spoken the truth. The house feels emptier without him, yet in that emptiness I hear something new, my own voice, steady and unbroken. I walk to the rooms and touch the walls, the photographs, the ordinary things that once mocked me, and I see them differently now. They're not monuments to deception, but reminders of my endurance, proof that I survived living inside someone else's shadow. There will be no tidy ending, no sudden erasure of grief, but there is clarity, and in that clarity, a kind of peace. One morning, as sunlight slipped through the blinds, I stood at the window and whispered the words I had been afraid to claim. This life is mine. Not perfect, not painless, but finally mine. And in the quiet that followed, I felt something like freedom. Not the absence of loss, but the presence of truth. That was enough. That will always be enough.